Up to Q&A.
Bill Hawley and Robert, thank you very much for this quick overview. It's a fascinating sector. It's hard to think of a sector that's got a more complicated supply chain than cocoa. The chart that was out there showing the supply chain, in fact, had intermediaries and traders somewhere shown up in the middle. But in countries like Côte d'Ivoire, that could be 4, 5, or 6 different levels. It's extremely complex and very, very challenging. So let's open it up for questions. I think the first part, what we could do is explore kind of general questions around the cocoa sector, around WCF's work in the sector, and then maybe drill down on their approach to partnerships. Already we've got some of the feedback in terms of their experience and explore the dimensions of partnership. And what this could also mean for IFC in terms of how we do our own business. So with that, I'll open it up for questions. Please introduce yourself. Tell us who you are and where you sit in the organization as well when you take the floor. All right? Who will break the ice and go first? That's always the... Oh, Herman, please.
Thank you, Bill. Great presentation. Germán Begarra, Global Head, Agribusiness and Forestry. A couple of questions. I draw the parallel with palm oil and how the demand changes, meaning the demand coming from the non-traditional Western markets has, had a lot to do with what happened with palm oil. Now, RSPO has come as a response, but perhaps a bit too late. My worry about when I see your logos is I see India and China not there. So the question for you is, if the demand from those countries, and I guess I'm not saying that they're bad, by the way, so but maybe the question is, how do we actually create that bridge to educate those markets about the importance of sustainable value chains? Because if we don't do that today, you're going to see the same problem that we saw with palm oil. The demand is just going to be so big, and practices are going to change. So that's number one. I like your point about coordinating bodies. I couldn't agree more with you. It is just so confusing right now to understand who's doing what in cocoa. Even ourselves are now trying to create something around cocoa. So I'm all for partnerships. I believe in working with the likes of you. So I think I want to leave the door open, at least from my side, to work with you guys and try to see how we can actually speed up change in the market. So just to start, thanks.
Why don't we take a couple more questions or reactions to the presentation so far? Please introduce yourself.
My name is Yara. I work in portfolio management and advisory services. My question, I think it's one of those traditional questions on the relationship between manufacturers, like, for example, Hershey's, and farmers. I was fascinated to hear. I was in St. Lucia some time ago, and I saw the demonstrations of cocoa farmers against Hershey. Hershey has the biggest factory in the island. And so do you deal with issues really, because I saw their logo and as part of the alliance. So you work with the farmers, but do you work as well on the education of these? I know it's fair trade type of work, but do you work also on educating those big manufacturers on, their social responsibilities also towards farmers? Thank you.
Anybody else ready for a question?
I have a similar question to Herman. My name is Esra Dekar Yilmaz. I work in the global agribusiness, working with a cocoa trader at the same time. We have seen a lot of demand for sustainable cocoa in the markets, Nestle, Cadbury, or Hershey making all these announcements. But this is, because of the consumer awareness in the developed markets for sustainable cocoa. With the demand now coming, especially for cocoa powder from China, India, from Brazil, do the chocolate manufacturers or World Cocoa Foundation doing any consumer awareness campaigns to increase the consumers' awareness there? Or is this actually a risk factor for the push for more sustainable cocoa? Is it going to derail the demand for it? Is it going to there won't be much incentive for the for the sector to keep on working with the farmers to make sure they're growing this cocoa sustainably. That was one question that I had, and the other one was about the M&A, and I think we're going to discuss that later on. I was wondering how many farmers have benefited from your farmer field school so far. Have you measured any increased income at the farmer level? That sort of thing, would like to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bill. Go ahead.
Well, I'll attempt to answer some of these, and then I'll also ask Holly and Robert if they can add some thoughts as well. Herman asked about the demand, and particularly in some of the emerging markets, China and India. And it was interesting. I was recently at an industry meeting, and there were some companies from Russia, and I gave them a side discussion. We had a side discussion talking about what we were doing, and I could tell that it wasn't really resonating with them. And I think what we need to do over time is just to continue educating the companies about why this is important and the value of it. And we typically, rather than go at the consumer level, we tend to focus more on the companies themselves. A lot of times these companies buy from processors and traders that are already members of WCF. So bringing them into that equation and that discussion is important too, because it gets the branded company or the manufacturer more involved in understanding what the processors is dealing with. So I think over time we've been successful. I look at the market of Japan is a fairly mature market, but when we first started there, I remember the first 3 visits I made there to the companies, we didn't get much traction, but it was on the third or fourth time that one started, and then when one joined, the other one didn't want to be left out, and pretty soon we had more and more companies. Now we have nine companies from Japan. So I hope that the same kind of evolution will happen in other markets, like in India, like in China, and we'll continue to move on that front.
Just to complement on Bill, in China and India, there's very little manufacturing going there. I've read recently that a few of our members are opening in factories in China, especially. I know that Cadbury has big presence in India. And there's little manufacturing going in those 2 countries currently. The other factor that we all know is that in some of these countries, products that we know of, like what you find here in any supermarket, are not available there. It's more cocoa powder-based products, like you were mentioning, basically because the distribution system there, the heat will melt all of the products. So it's cocoa used on cookies, on ice cream, or very low quality kind of finished products, but not of the consistency or not of the quality that you find here or in Europe. So that's another aspect of it. And as Bill said, we have limited resources, and we cannot reach out to consumers. I go out to the corner and say to anybody, do you know what World Cocoa Foundation is? No, nobody knows what World Cocoa Foundation is. I think we need to put our best efforts to reaching out to our companies and have them talk more and reach millions of consumers out there. It will be a daunting and impossible task for us. But hopefully someday, as Bill said, we will be able to get to some manufacturing companies in China and in India, but we're not there yet.
I guess the other main question was Yoli, you mentioned specifically about Hershey, and we've seen an evolution in the way that the companies interact with us over time. I remember when we first started, there was discussion about youth education, and one of the companies came up and told me, he said, we will never invest in youth education. We're about cocoa farmers today. That's outside of our mandate. That's the Ministry of Education's responsibility in those countries. Now that company is investing in youth education programs. And I've seen that same evolution happen with others. So as they get more engaged in these projects, they see the importance that you have to go beyond just helping farmers produce more cocoa. There's a need to look at some of the environmental factors, some of the social factors. But until they actually get involved and active in the programs, it's sometimes more difficult for them to see. So I'm really pleased, particularly when I see these matching grants that we have with the Gates Foundation under the Cocoa Livelihoods Program, where the companies are actually helping to do the work themselves and seeing the importance and the needs of cocoa farmers. Want to say anything else?
Yeah, one qualitative thing to add to that is that we've also seen a growing number of executive level people among our industry partners want to go to the regions. Yeah. So we have an office actually in Ghana of about 11 people, and they're often hosting people into the farms in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, I'd say, for the most part. But that's been a real upscale since, I'd say, 2009, of CEO levels going to see what the situation is actually on the farm, what the programs are doing.
Do you want to say something about the M&E, the impact?
Sure. I think you asked about the M&E. Well, for the ECHOS program, which is the youth-focused one, we've been reaching 25,000 beneficiaries to date. That started in 2007. It's a mixture of how you look at those beneficiaries. Some are the youth in the schools that are receiving the agricultural training. Some are teachers in the communities that are trained in curricula, ag curricula. Others are administrative bodies of the schools to recruit teachers into the community. The family support scholarships that we mentioned, I think we've awarded over 500 to women in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. So our stats, I think, so far on ECHOS are very much of numbers of beneficiaries receiving the training or the services. Same for the Cocoa Livelihoods Program. Our goal is 200,000 farmers that double their income within 10 years. It is a 10-year horizon that we have. We started in 2009. We provide training and services to about 140,000 farmers to date. We've done a baseline study that took a year in the region that gave us our control and treatment groups. The midterm evaluation will start next year of looking at the yield data. That's where we start at the 400 kg per hectare. We've done some farmer focus group surveys where we go into the field and talk to about 50 farmers in a region. And we've seen yield increases about 50% from their responses of the good agricultural practices training they're receiving. But I think the real yield change will come over time and only with the proper inputs. I think you're not going to double or triple if you don't have the proper material, especially fertilizer. So we'll know more, I think, in the coming years on the yield changes.
Thanks, Holly. I've got a question, Bill. What are your expectations or the requirements of your members? I mean, how do you keep them honest and that they don't sign up just, for the privilege to say that they're a member of the Cocoa Foundation?
Well, I think that as part of the recruitment process, when we have companies join, we ask them, first of all, to agree to certain our bylaws and our mission. And then it's really up to us as a staff and with the other company members to see how we can make companies not only members but active members within WCF. And having these platforms like with the Cocoa Livelihoods Program, like with the African Cocoa Initiative, allow companies to not only pay membership but also to go the step further to really pay extra money for those programs and to actively participate. So a lot of the onus is on us, and each time we visit with the companies, we try to see if we can push them a little bit further. It's not always about the financial resources, but also about their time and effort in becoming active in the programs.
Let's open up, please.
I want to move a little bit the focus of the discussion towards...
Your name, please?
I'm sorry. My name is Ivan Ivanov. I'm the agribusiness specialist with the Sustainable Business Advisory and Mass. I wanted to move the focus of the discussion and towards the hosting countries, the producing countries, and their governments, because in many of those instances, actually, it's a failing government that's the problem, and the whole sustainability push comes from the consumers in aging countries, and actually the brands are under pressure. But I saw in your last annual conference here that you work with those governments. There were 5 ministers from Cote d'Ivoire alone. My question is rather, do you see a partnership to help those governments more effectively, and if so, what it should constitute of?
Sure. Laura McKenna. I'm head of Global Agricultural Food Security Program here at IFC. And my question was actually in the same spirit that Yvonne just posed. What is the role that World Cocoa Foundation is doing brokering between the private sector industry and governments, and how effective is that? And is that what your industry participants are relying on you for? Thanks.
Very similar.
Sure. Well, in any project that we do, we start with the government engagement. We're not an organization that goes in and just implements a program without having, first of all, the endorsement of the government. And I can look at the examples of, for example, what we're doing again with the Cocoa Livelihoods Program. We have government representatives from each of those countries that are part of the steering committee, and we meet every 6 months in Africa. The governments host those meetings, so it rotates from one country to the next. When we first started out, the governments asked us, well, we'd like to have a per diem and our travel costs paid for, and we said no. They said, well, then we won't come, and we said, well, then we can't implement our program in your country. And it's interesting because everyone has representatives now that pay their own way. They pay their own travel, they pay their own hotel expenses, and they host the meetings. We haven't yet gotten to the stage where we're getting beyond in-kind contributions from the host governments, but they like it as well, having these steering committee meetings, because they get to talk face-to-face with the company members and hear what the companies are saying. So we play the brokerage role of trying to bring the governments and the companies closer together through these programs, and it's easier doing it when it's a program focused than rather like a roundtable discussion that doesn't necessarily have a start or end to it. And we can see progress being made every 6 months, and I think that's what really excites not only the companies but the governments.
And just to add to that, I think it all depends on what member companies you're referring to. Some of our members have presence in the countries, and of course ADM or Cargill, for instance, they have facilities in Cote d'Ivoire or in Ghana. They have direct relationships with the government at all levels. They're happy to see when we come into town or when we have events in DC that we invite them, and sometimes we help out with different issues at different levels that it would be difficult for a single company to come up with. So coming under the umbrella of World Cocoa Foundation, sometimes it is beneficial for them as well to use us as brokerage in that sense. So they don't rely exclusively on us, but sometimes it's helpful for them.
I mean, it sounds like the partnerships with governments are very program oriented, and I think from where we sit is it's going to take a long time for these changes at the program level to really kind of work their way through the entire system and really get a transformation of the market. And of course, this is an area where IFC has some leverage. Certainly, the World Bank has some leverage, and the World Bank, as you might know, is working in Cote d'Ivoire, trying to help restructure the cocoa sector. So there are other pieces to the puzzle that are I think, coming into place to try and really get that transformation that is required in the sector. Same thing with some of the environmental and social issues in terms of harmful child labor and deforestation, which are very clearly linked with cocoa production. Let's move on. Any other questions or reactions to, please?
Bruce Wise from Sustainable Business Advisory. I think you mentioned the issue around farmer organisation and the actual building or creation of these. Apart from Sokadevi, who else is out there actively creating this, if you like, institutional base from sort of, which to me looks like the layer that is sort of so missing that we can't build anything from? I mean, who should we be pushing to spend more money on this sort of work? And please don't say IFC.
I actually want to say the private sector, because I think you have to look at who's on the ground day to day with these farmers, and that's what we're starting to see anyway with these matching grants, that the exporters and the processors who are there buying the cocoa and working with the local traiton, maybe in Cote d'Ivoire, or the licensed buying company in Ghana, they know these farmers and they're working to get them aggregated because they know they cannot reach them otherwise. So I think there's going to be more innovative models around like input suppliers, or around, we have something called a business service center. That's a physical center in a community that provides inputs to the farmers, but also training is there. There's a specialized agent based at the business service center, and those are run by the local community head. So it's leveraging these footprints, I think, that are already in the communities as a central point. There's even some movement, I think, in Cote d'Ivoire of looking at the traitant, who's the middleman before the exporter, around their bush warehouses, because they move a ton of cocoa, like 200,000 tons in Soubray region, around this one traitant that controls the pisteur, the guys on the motorbikes with the bags of beans on their motorbike. It's a central point for these really remote areas. So I think in the future phases of Cocoa Livelihoods program, which we're working on right now with the Gates Foundation, it is aggregating non-organized farmers around these players low down in the supply chain.
Yes, please. Mark, because we've got people on the phone. Just make sure they hear your question.
Just sort of reverting to the basics, but you know, in the engagements in the cocoa sector, as we know in agribusiness and so on in IFC, is that we're hit, obviously, as you guys are in your membership, with the child labor issue. So just to get to the sort of the most raw political issue associated with the sector, I mean, if we gave you an audience in front of our board, okay, which comes from our member countries, and they're trying to decide whether to say yay or nay to an IFC engagement in the cocoa sector, and there's also at the table is a child labor focused hostile NGO. They say their piece. What's your piece? What are you going to say in response, in effect, as to, you know, what's the rationale for our engagement?
That's something that I do often. So,
Pardon while we take notes.
Well, you know, and I think that it's a very important topic, and as I was mentioning earlier, if there is a way that we can work with farming families to help educate and sensitize them to what Western consumers want and what's good for them, as well as their governments, as well as the private sector, it's a win for all of us. A lot of times it's just distilling on what it means by that, because worst forms of child labor means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. We've worked with the ILO for many years. It's been now 8 years, and we use as our benchmark ILO Convention 182 and 138. And if you look within that code, there's really three main areas that we're trying to make headway on. And one is to making sure that farming is safer. So it's the types of activities that not only children but that adults do on the farm. Are pesticides being sprayed? Are the children in the fields when that happens? Are they using machetes or anything dangerous? And that's an education process. It's a way of trying to educate the parents as well as the children, and also the teachers that in the community, and community leaders. There's also the problem of length of work that children do on the farm. A lot of times farming is an apprenticeship for children who are going to become farmers someday themselves, so they're learning about how to farm. But if they're spending 8 or 9 hours working on a farm a day, that's not acceptable by ILO convention standards. And then the last area is you have to provide access to education. And that's the area that we're pushing hardest on through our education programs, is to provide educational opportunities for young people so that they can go to school and that they can have a better future. And that takes the active participation and involvement with the government. That's not something the private sector can do on its own. It's really a partnership in order to achieve that. And we welcome others to help join that effort as well. If there are NGOs that have some valuable resources on the ground or some ideas on programming, we're open to that.
So, Mark, if you were sitting at the board, how would you react? Would you be satisfied, or would you say that more has to be done? And
partially convinced. I think.
Okay. Maybe Robert has the other part of the answer.
Just what Bill said, and I think he said it right honestly, it's we cannot generalize about child labor. It's the worst forms of child labor, and I think that clarity has to be understood, and it's the base of any argument with anybody. Child labor, I grew up in a farm in a way. Did I go to school? Yes, I went to school as well. So there are that aspects of development and future and values and opportunities that childs learn at a farm. So there is a role for children at farms. What's appropriate and what's inappropriate. And I think that's the awareness piece that needs attention. And the other aspect of this is that sometimes, and I hope Bill agrees with me, but sometimes it's very easy to say things in Washington or in Paris or in New York after this, but let's forget that these are governments and there's institutions in those countries. And sometimes people forget about that. There's roles that government Côte d'Ivoire or Ghana have to play on this as well, and they are. So we need to respect also what's happening on the government and the institution of a government in those countries, and not simply say, oh, it's our job to go there. No, we need to partner with those governments.
Yeah, and just to add on, Robert says it's all about the partnerships with the governments. We had exactly the same type of program in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire for child labor prevention. We made a lot of headway in Ghana and limited in Côte d'Ivoire over the last few years. And people asked why. Well, it's because of the level of engagement of the government. The government working very seriously with the private sector, with ILO and other partners to make that happen. In Côte d'Ivoire now, we're very excited that there's really a major push to address the problem. We're signing an MOU with Madame Ouattara tomorrow at the Côte d'Ivoire Embassy that outlines how we're going to align our educational programs with their oversight committee on addressing child labor, because we're providing educational opportunities for youth. So it's a great way to bring public and private sector together to address an important issue.
Bill?
Bill Bulmer from Environment Social Governance Department. Just one comment and then a question. One of the issues that we face on this one is that we've had some board members, as Mark here knows, ask IFC to provide almost a guarantee that there would not be something like child labor in the projects that we invest in. And of course, that sort of binary application is just simply impossible. But what it does, I think, emphasizes the need for some sort of proxies for measuring progress, things like improvements in farmer incomes and things like that, which can really have an impact. And then, of course, there are precautions and measures that we would need to see taken to lower it. But can we guarantee that there's no child labor in the projects that we invest in? Of course not. That's simply impossible. But that's not something that's clearly understood by many of our own stakeholders. So expectations are way out of line for what we can deliver, and therefore this discussion is really important in terms of how we communicate with stakeholders that have these sort of expectations. The question that I have is about the partnerships. So we see a lot of interest now, particularly from donors, in projects where they can really see good, tangible results, where money is being used effectively. So are you still in the stage now where you're actively looking for new partnerships, or are people looking for you now? Or are you in that sort of nice stage where you're, sort of having people coming up and it's not really a big burden on you to look for partnerships? Where do you stand now in that?
Bill, it happens both ways. I mean, we're always looking for new partnerships, trying to find value, not only financially, but also from a technical standpoint, bringing in other partners that can add something value to our current programs, or to do another program with them, and then also to continue on with our current partners. So sometimes I think at times when we have some large programs, we're tapped out, but there's always interest by our membership to look at how we can enhance that, or how we can bring in other partners. So that's the really exciting part about working with this organization. Every day when I come into work, it's always something a little bit different, something new and exciting. And yeah, we really enjoy that, and I think that's what makes the programs meaningful is to have different types of partners involved.
But just in terms of the attention that it gets for you and your job, is this a major part of your job for the organization and looking for these partnerships and securing funding? No, that's...
It is. A lot of my time is spent on partnership development, but as well as the staff. We have an office in Ghana, as Holly mentioned, and we have visitors come there often, whether that be from the private sector or from other development agencies. And by actually seeing the programs on the ground, sometimes that sparks interest of people to look at it, something new that we can do. We recently launched a program with Hershey on looking at how we use cell phone technology to help reach more farmers. That was something that was a result of a visit that they took to Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire a few last year. We've had students from land-grant universities that have visited and have identified a niche or a problem area that they'd like to help tackle, and it's wonderful. We've done that. We've recently signed an MOU with the Peace Corps, the U.S. Peace Corps. We have a volunteer working with us in Ghana on youth education. So it comes in different ways. Sometimes it's people coming to us, or sometimes it's us reaching out to them.
We have a few minutes left. Any final questions or comments? Chris? Sure. Please.
So, Richard, CPA, so I'll ask another partnerships-related question, if I may. Cocoa sector and industry is highly competitive, and I think WCF has done a great job in terms of building collaboration across what is a very competitive landscape. But perhaps if you could say a few words about how you've done that. So you can't work with every company's supply chain. You've got to choose one. How do you choose that one? How do you balance those competing interests? Are there particular sensitivities that you have to be very careful of in terms of building that collaboration? So that's one question on partnerships. The other one is palm oil was mentioned. Now, palm oil isn't the same as cocoa, as you know, and coffee's not the same either, but it seems that there are, to varying degrees, similar issues that these particular commodities are also facing. And I've met with RSPO, and they were talking about similar things and similar problems and similar challenges to varying degrees. Has there been a chance to reach out to other commodity bodies to see for opportunities for partnership there? Thanks.
These companies are highly competitive. And it's branded company competing with branded company. It's processor competing with processor, trader competing with trader. And a lot of times, I turn to Robert and Holly too, who have a lot of experience dealing with this. But a lot of times, what we do is we bring people together, but we also have the one-on-one conversations. During teleconferences, sometimes when we're talking with several of the company members, I'll get emails from them saying, well, I want to ask this question, but I don't want anyone to know that it's my question. So they put us in that role, and which is fine. It's great because we can ask sometimes things that others are thinking, but because of either their client relationship or their competitors there, they don't want that question associated with them. So we try to always be sensitive to their needs and where they are in the supply chain, and not to put them in an uncomfortable position, and realize that sometimes we have to go at it 2 or 3 times before we can come to some kind of a resolution.
I think in a way the competition helps a bit also, because if the branded manufacturers know that the 3 are there but the 1 is not, the 1 will come. And even in our composition of our boards for our special programs, there's a seat for each, and they are there. And even how we do the breakout groups, we mix them among each other. So there's a certain design side to it, I think, there. But there's also, you can agree upon pre-competitive objectives. And when you bring them to the table, when you design the program, you agree to those objectives, and that's why they're dedicated to the program. So I think it is a bit challenging, but it's more rewarding. Like when we mentioned earlier about this last board meeting of It's the 7th one now for the Gates Foundation program. There was better discussion and more open discussion among the industry than we've ever had. And I think there's now this element of trust, and seeing progress on the ground also is exciting to the group. But again, it's the objectives that they had in mind at the beginning and seeing it play out.
Thanks, Holly. Bill, I'm going to close in a few minutes. Any final words from you before I kind of summarize a bit?
Well, I guess just to quickly touch on Chris's last question on other industries or other sectors, and that's something we're always interested in doing too. We have partnership meetings every 6 months that brings together our industry members and other stakeholders in different locations. And we've had, for example, the Better Cotton Initiative speak before at one of our sessions. We learned a lot from that. Levi Strauss. We've had cashew speakers talk before. I'm just coming from a meeting in Seattle that was hosted by the Gates Foundation, where they brought in all of their grantees under the cash crops, and it was great for me to learn about what other initiatives are doing, and it's surprising how a lot of them are facing the same kind of challenges, whether it's farmer aggregation or access to finance. So we can learn a lot from hearing what others are doing.
Bill, Holly, Robert, thank you very much. It was great to have you here today for this Partnership Matters discussion. And what I learned is that partnerships do matter, which is great. I think the Cocoa Foundation has done tremendous work in terms of mobilizing the industry. I think, as Bruce pointed out, I think that the biggest challenge right now is in the downstream partnerships. You've got the upstream partnerships. It's in the implementation, execution on the ground. And it's hard to turn to many of our governments to do this. They've got very limited capacity, certainly in Cote d'Ivoire, for example. So again, you've got no choice but to turn to the private sector to fill that gap to some extent, maybe to a large extent. But that's good, because that's the area where IFC is active, both in terms of advisory and investment. And I think therein lies the opportunity for us to partner as well with WCF and others, and then really helping transform the cocoa market to what it needs to be by 2020. Right. So with this, thank you all very much. It was great to have you here. Chris, thank you very much for inviting me. It was fun. And look forward to the next event. And do you have an announcement on the next event?
Bill, thanks very much. Thank you for facilitating so well. Thank you to our guests. Just quickly, if you could fill out your forms. Next event, we're hoping to organise for a few weeks' time, and we're hoping to have the UK ED come to talk to us about partnerships and her perspectives on what we're doing well or what we could do better. So please come and join us for that. But thank you all, and thanks particularly to our guests.